Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about counteroffers. And there was some changes made to the counteroffers in December when there was updates to forms in that December revision. So we're going to talk up a little bit about those. We're going to look at the forms themselves, the seller counteroffer, the multiple counteroffer, and the buyer's counteroffer. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the counter verbiage too. And let's see how far we get. If we get to that, we'll pull up the RPA, we'll look at counters, we'll talk about how to counter certain aspects of that. But today where we're going to start is with the forms themselves. So before I share my screen, does anybody have any questions about anything? Okay, remember you can type your question in the chat. You can raise your hand, and I will get to your question as soon as possible. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so what you should be seeing right now is the seller counteroffer. I like that they added at the top, may not be used as a multiple counteroffer. People have made this mistake in the past where they use this one and send it to multiple buyers. I've seen it from the other side. I've even seen some of our people do that and use it, and you can't do that. If you send out a seller counteroffer, as soon as that counteroffer is signed and returned to you, you have an accepted offer. Okay? There is no, hey, let me pick which one of these I want. There is another form for that specifically, and we'll talk about that one next. But this is just, if I've got one offer, I want to counter the terms of that offer, this is what I'm going to use, okay? It's pretty straightforward at the top here, whatever counteroffer number it is going to be. If it is the first one I'm sending out, then it's number 1. If it's the second or third, then it's going to be number 2 or 3. The date is the date that I created it. This date is going to be the date of the offer that I received. So let's say that offer was dated yesterday. Okay, this is a counteroffer to the purchase agreement. Okay, so you want to make sure that those dates are correct. This is the buyer, this is the seller's names. Pretty straightforward. Okay, this is what I want you guys to be clear, because I still see in counteroffers a lot where people are writing down here all other terms to remain the same. That's not necessary. The terms and conditions of the above referenced document are accepted subject to the following. So basically what that's saying is whatever I don't write here, we're agreeing with. So the idea that I have to write all other terms to remain the same is unnecessary. It's something that you're just adding that you don't need to. So first off, you guys don't counter enough most of the time, and now you're adding to a counter something you don't need. So again, we talk about professionalism and making sure our things are, clean and straightforward and strong and all of that. That's one of the things we have to eliminate. There's no need to write all other terms remain the same, because it's basically saying that right here in the terms. The terms and conditions of the above referenced document are accepted subject to the following. Okay. Liquidated damages and arbitration of disputes paragraphs in the offer each require initials by all parties. If either of those paragraphs is not initialed by all parties, the paragraph is excluded from the final agreement unless specifically referenced for inclusion in paragraph 1D of this or another counteroffer. So we talked about it a little bit when we went through the RPA. If that paragraph for dispute resolution or for liquidated damages, right? If one party initials it and the other party doesn't, it is not included as part of the transaction. So to be completely clear, if you want it to be included, it has to be part of the counter that initial is going to be taken care of by whichever party didn't initial it. I also like the idea of just saying, like, dispute resolution or liquidated damage is not part of the transaction, even though it says it right here. I know that's a little redundant after I said you don't need to put all other terms and conditions, but people don't read that part of it. And the counter is the way it works. Just be clear. You either want it or you don't. It needs to be initialed by both parties or it's not part of the transaction. Okay? Unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counteroffer, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as the original offer, but the dollar amount of any initial and increased deposit and seller's credits shall remain unchanged from the original offer. I like that that's in there, that it makes sense to you guys. If I have a 10% down payment and my original offer is at 600 and now we raise the price to 625, well then my $60,000 down payment is now 62,500. It automatically switches. Okay? It doesn't do that for initial deposit. So if I need to change the initial deposit, I need to reference specifically initial deposit or increased deposit, the new amount that I want those to be. We've talked about that in the past. Okay? Unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counteroffer, if in the original offer, the appraisal contingency amount is lower than the original offered price, then the dollar amount of any difference, appraisal gap, shall remain unchanged and be deducted from the final contract price to create the final appraisal contingency amount. For example, if the purchase price in the offer is $1 million and buyer reduces appraisal contingency value to $950, the appraisal gap is $50,000. If the purchase price is increased to $1.2 million as a result of the counteroffer, the appraisal contingency value shall be adjusted to $1,150,000. If the property appraises below $1,150,000, buyer may exercise the appraisal contingency right to cancel this agreement. So you have to understand how the math works, right? We've talked about it in writing an offer in the past, where we say, if you're agreeing to pay an amount different from the sales price and an appraised value, right? Like, I only needed to appraise for X. As long as it appraises for X, I'll move forward and I'll pay the difference between the sales price and the appraised value. In this case, what they're saying is if I don't specifically reference that the appraisal gap is increasing with the increased sales price, the appraisal gap remains the same and my appraised value increases by that appraisal gap. So it sounds a little confusing, but it's right there in black and white, which is easy to look at and try to understand. And for a listing agent, what you guys have to understand is this: if you want their appraisal value to remain the same and them to pay any difference based on that appraisal, then you've got to reference it in your counteroffers. Okay? Questions about those, about the top three, 1A, B, and C? Anybody have any questions? Okay. So, other terms, this is where we're going to write in the items that we're countering. We're going to type it in here. I always like to number my items, so whatever it is, sales, I'm just writing stuff. We'll talk about actually countering sales price, to be, no termite will not be, whatever. Okay, so I like to number them just because it makes it look cleaner. This is the other thing. And two, this is just about keeping things, tidy, right? Like, just to be efficient. If I know that in a counteroffer, I'm going to exceed this, instead of typing away and letting all this stuff come up and then having a text overflow addendum get attached, I'd rather start with C addendum or C attached addendum number 1. And then just put everything on the addendum. Put all my counterpoints on the addendum. That's just me. That's a housekeeping thing, just to be kind of tidy in how it works. So it's just not reading half and then going to another page and reading the rest. It's nice to have all those counters on one page. So I would just start with that. But that's just my choice. However you guys choose to do it. Any of these documents that are included that you send with the counter, even though they're attached to the counter, unless that document gets signed, it's not part of the transaction, right? So the following attached documents are incorporated into the seller counteroffer. When signed and delivered by both parties, right, they're incorporated. So addendums, right? So if I have C addendum number 1, if I write that in the top, C addendum number 1, then I'm going to put addendum number 1 there. If part of my counteroffer is making you a backup offer, then I'm going to check off the box for the backup offer addendum. If part of my counter is seller to remain in possession, then I'm going to include the SIP. If part of it is seller is purchasing a replacement property, that's part of my counter, then I'm going to check the box for this. So just be aware that whatever verbiage that we have here in the counter, which we're going to go over in the second half of this, whatever is there, make sure that those boxes are checked, incorporating those documents into your counteroffer. Okay? Expiration of offer. This seller counteroffer shall be deemed revoked, and the deposits, if any, shall be returned unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after the date of the seller counteroffer is signed. So it's when it's signed, not the date it was created, but the date that the seller signed it. Because we know that sometimes we do counters and then we don't see the seller that day, or we see them the next day. So the date it was signed by the seller is the day the clock starts ticking for those 3 days. Okay? If more than one signature, then the last signature date. We had this I think it was a week or two ago. An agent asked me, hey, I have 2 sellers, but one of them can't sign. He's hard to get a hold of. If I sign it with one and send it, and I said, no, you can't do that, because then the clock still doesn't start ticking until that last person signs, whatever the date is. So you might as well get everybody to sign, no matter how difficult it may be. Get everybody to sign at the same time, so at least you know where your dates start. Okay. It is signed in paragraph 5 by the buyer, and a copy of the signed seller counteroffer is delivered to the seller or seller's authorized agent. So that's it. In that period of time, in those 3 days, in order for this to be accepted, right? So we're talking about a seller counteroffer right now, not a multiple counter. We're talking about a seller counter. So if within that 3 days the buyer does not sign it and get it back, I'll show you later, there is a mechanism in place for it to still be accepted. But if it hasn't been accepted in that 3 days, then the seller doesn't have to honor this counteroffer anymore. And yes, the clock starts ticking from the dates these documents are signed, not when escrow is opened. Okay. Now, with the seller counteroffer, if the seller withdraws the seller counteroffer anytime prior to buyer's acceptance by communicating withdrawal to buyer or buyer's agent, they have to use the form withdrawal of offer. So let's say, for example, that you did send out a counter, a single counter, just the SCO. And then, which sometimes seems to happen, it's a little bit miraculous, is I've not had any offers. As soon as I send that seller counteroffer out, I get other offers. If in between the time that I send that seller counteroffer and I get it signed and returned, if I send them a withdrawal of offer, this counteroffer is no longer valid. And on the withdrawal of offer form, and as a matter of fact, let's bring it up right now. Let's add a withdrawal of offer. Let's look at that right now. So withdrawal of offer is here. And so I can withdraw my purchase agreement. I can withdraw a counteroffer, a seller counteroffer, a multiple counteroffer. If I do withdraw one of those things, I can substitute now a new multiple counter. So I can still give them an opportunity because I've gotten other offers. So now I'm sending multiple counters out to everybody. I can substitute it, or I could just withdraw and revoke it. That's what happens. If I don't check this box in 3, if I just go with the default here, if you look at 1C, the buyer or seller making the offer hereby withdraws and revokes it. That's it. I'm just taking it out. You're out of the running. But if I don't want them out, I want them to have an opportunity. It's just that I had another offer that I don't also want to miss out on, then I can attach a substitute. Okay? So that's what this looks like. And the right way to do it is to withdraw the offer, substitute if you want, but withdraw the offer before you counter another offer that may come in. Okay? So let's go back to the seller counteroffer. So you can withdraw it. But if you just accept another offer in the meantime, which I'm sorry seems a little despicable, right, without doing the whole withdraw thing. If you do accept an offer before they sign and return the counteroffer, that is okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it's allowed, right? I don't advise doing it that way. The withdrawal of offer is the cleanest way to do it, like just telling them, hey, you're out, we're accepting another offer. At least it's in writing. And you have some proof that you sent that prior to, but I don't know. It just seems a little bit ugly when there's a counteroffer that's out and then you accept another offer, even though, yes, you can do it until that one is returned to you. Okay, so that's paragraph 2. Paragraph 3, while my counters are out, obviously, and I think everybody knows this, we're going to leave it open, active on the MLS to continue to market it for other buyers until you send that counter, because we know that sometimes we send counter offers out and buyers don't return it, right? So I want to continue to market it just in case that one doesn't work out. Okay. Paragraph 4. This is another thing that it, even though it's in my counter sheet, this has kind of rendered it unnecessary. If you want to add it, you can. So seller makes this counteroffer on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy. By making this counteroffer, any previous offer or counteroffer can no longer be accepted. This counteroffer is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counteroffer expired by its terms. The terms and conditions of those documents are incorporated into the seller counteroffer unless otherwise agreed. So what it's saying there is, even if the offer that I'm countering you, this counteroffer is attached to, even if it's expired, it's still valid, the terms of this counteroffer. So it's kind of in there, but now in the boilerplate, verbiage of the counteroffer. It's not super clear, so if you want to continue to add it, I've left it in my counteroffers. The verbiage of the counteroffers that I have sent you guys in the past, I've left it in there. Only because it becomes a choice then if you want to use it. It's stated here, but you can add it if you want to clarify. Okay. Any questions so far on paragraphs 1 through 4? Anybody? No? Okay. Paragraph 5. This is where the buyer is accepting the counteroffer. So if the buyer just accepts the terms of the seller's counteroffer, all they have to do is sign. But if the buyer is going to counter back some of the terms, then you check off the box that says it is subject to the attached buyer counteroffer. So that way they know that, yes, I'm accepting this, except for the things that I'm going to reference in my buyer counter to answer back. Now, when the seller counteroffer is highest and best offer and, all those terms where the buyer is required to respond, you're going to have to check off the box for attached buyer counteroffer. Okay. So buyer signs it and sends it back. Now, here's what I talked about earlier, right? We know that this is 3 days from the final date that it was signed by all the sellers. They've now added this paragraph of late acceptance. If the date of buyer's signature in paragraph 5 is after the expiration specified in paragraph 2A, buyer's acceptance is only binding if seller agrees to the late acceptance by signing before 5 p.m. on the third date after the date the seller counteroffer is signed. So now we're, adding those 3 days again. So what happens is I send you a counteroffer today, signed today. And then you get it, right? So it's Thursday today. It's going to expire on Sunday at 5 o'clock. But you don't send it back to me until Monday. So you sign it Monday and send it to me on Monday. And now we say, okay, well, we still want to accept it, or we want to think about it. I have 3 days from the date you signed it. So if you sign it on Monday, which is 28th, 1st, 2nd, the 3rd. So if you sign it on the 3rd, I have until the 6th at 5 p.m. to decide whether or not I want to accept your offer. So if you send this back to me late, even though it's only a seller counteroffer, not a multiple, if I don't acknowledge that I'm okay with receiving it late, I don't have to accept your offer. Okay, so that's a change that was made in December that was never on the offers before about late offers. If they were back late, that was it. All bets were off. Okay. Questions about the seller counteroffer? Anybody? No? Okay, so the seller multiple counteroffer is basically identical to the seller counteroffer. Okay, Sarah has a question. She typed question.
Thank you. Hi, Kyle.
Yeah.
Forgive me, it's because I'm driving. I just have a question. If during that weekend I was to get a phone call, a verbal a call from the agent advising that all signatures won't happen until Monday, what do I do with that? Is it
Nothing. It
still
doesn't mean anything.
expired?
Doesn't mean anything. Still expires.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would just tell the agent, well, that's fine. You can sign it on Monday, but that offer's expired. If we choose to accept it after that date, that's on us. We'll sign it and resend it back to you. But we have no obligation because you called me to tell me you're going to be late. We have no obligation to honor the counteroffer being returned late. So it doesn't change anything, the phone calls. Okay. So again, this top section, paragraph 1, is identical. It's the same. The only thing they changed here is the binding effect is now in here. Sellers making multiple counteroffers to other prospective buyers on terms that may or may not be the same as in this multiple counteroffer. This multiple counteroffer does not bind seller and buyer unless all of the following occur in the time specified below. Seller signs in paragraph 5, buyer signs in paragraph 7, seller signs in paragraph 8, and buyer receives a copy of the multiple counteroffer with all of the signatures. Note, prior to the completion of all of the foregoing, buyer and seller shall have no duties or obligations for the purchase or sale of the property. Okay, so all of those things have to happen. Seller has to sign in paragraph 5, buyer has to sign in 7, seller has to sign again in 8, and return a copy to the buyer, all within the time specified in those areas, which is always 3 days. Okay, so keep that in mind. Expiration, same, 3 days. Marketing to others, same thing. Until I get an accepted offer, I can leave it as active on the MLS. Seller making it so the same thing that we did before, right? This is any previous offer or counteroffer can no longer be accepted. This counteroffer is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counteroffer expired by its terms. So just like before, even if your offer expired and I'm making this counter to you for that expired offer, if you accept this, the terms of that expired offer are considered valid. Okay. Again, you can add that verbiage into your counters if you want to clarify it anymore, if you think that that's necessary to clarify it. So just know that you're going to have that. And I'll, again, in the second half of the class, I'm pretty sure we're going to get to it today. We'll look at those counters. Okay. So everything's the same. Seller signs. We're making this. The acceptance, you have 3 days, right? Buyer acceptance of the seller multiple counter shall be deemed revoked and deposit, if any, right? 5 p.m., 3 days after. So if the buyer signs down here and accepts it, if the seller wants to accept it, then the seller signs it and sends it back. Now, the difference on this one is the late acceptance, right? So if, for example, the buyer signs this multiple counter, sends it to the seller, and the seller doesn't return it in the 3 days like they're supposed to, right? Saying, hey, we accept it. And they get it back to the buyer later. The buyer now has to sign saying, yes, we're agreeing to the terms, even though it's past the time period. Okay. And that's the same thing that we'll see on the buyer's counteroffer. Again, buyer counteroffer, paragraph 1, exactly the same. Paragraph 2 is the same as as the seller's counteroffer. Here's the acceptance, and then the late acceptance. So if the seller signs it and doesn't return it on time, the buyer has to sign for that late acceptance. So I like that they've added in, a mechanism for when the offers are late or when they've expired to still allow all of these to be valid. So any questions about the document themselves? Got a thumbs up, which I appreciate. No questions though. All right, so let's do this. What I'm going to do now is we're going to add the purchase agreement, and I'm going to see if I can have the screens here so you can see two different things. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so for those of you guys that are new, haven't seen this before, and for those of you that have, let me get this stuff out of here. We don't need this anymore. Okay. I have put together some common counteroffer verbiage that a seller may use in the counter. So we're looking at this from a seller's perspective, countering a purchase agreement that they received. Okay. And so what I did is I just put it in order by paragraph, so that when you're looking through the paragraph, if you look and say, oh, I may need to counter this, you can go back to this document, look at what the verbiage is. You could even copy and paste into your counteroffer if you want. I did that on purpose to try to make this easy. So we're going to look at both of these. Okay. So obviously the first thing that we look at is paragraph 1B. That's the address. Okay. Now we're not going to counter who the buyer is because we don't really know. Whatever the buyer's name is on there, we can't counter it because we just assume that the buyer's agent knows who their buyer is. So the next logical place for us that there may be a counteroffer is the address. And it's important that you guys understand as listing agents that you look at it. Make sure you're reading it. Don't just glance at it and be like, oh yeah, that's the street name. Make sure the numbers aren't transposed. Make sure things are spelled correctly. So first part of that, buyer is aware that address on RPA is incorrect. Correct address is, and then you put the one, buyer to verify any inconsistencies prior to open of escrow. You want to make sure that they meant to write an offer on your property. I know it sounds silly, but it has been an issue in the past. The other is if there's an unpermitted unit, right? Because you could just create addresses for units, and even if it's not legal with the city, the post office will still recognize that address. Buyers aware the address for whatever unit was created for an unpermitted unit is not a legal address. That's it. We're disclosing everything right from the beginning. We're putting it in our counteroffer. And then the last thing for address is the APN. If they do have an APN and the APN is incorrect, then buyer is aware the APN number is incorrect. The correct APN number is. Very straightforward. I know that maybe some of the that stuff seems like maybe very common sense, but here it is to remind you, if you're going to do counters, to take a look at those items to make sure that they are correct. The next section is paragraph 2B, the confirmation of agency. We want to make sure that as the listing agent that agency confirmation is done properly, because that's how it's going to confirm who's representing who. Buyer and seller are aware that Century 21 All-Stars license number 101280965 is the broker, and your name and your license number is the agent representing the seller exclusively, and blank is the broker, and blank is the agent representing the buyer exclusively. You're going to put their information in there if they didn't do that. I mean, you would assume that they would do at least theirs, but I want to clarify the whole confirmation. Now, you could take it a step further. There is a confirmation of agency form in the C.A.R., and you could say, hey, confirmation, instead of writing it out, you could say confirmation of agency form is attached to this counteroffer. Please sign and return with counteroffer. You could do that if you wanted to, or you could just put it here and that confirmation is done. Okay. So now we get into paragraph 3, where really just about all of our counters are going to be. This is from us doing the purchase agreement, so I'm going to take all this stuff off while we're going through it. Okay, so first thing, increase sales price. Pretty straightforward. Sales price to be and what it is. If we're going to counter highest and best, right? Because we're looking at paragraph 3A right here. So the nice thing is 3A, you go right over. If we're going to counter highest and best, I just got advice a long time ago from an attorney that said, if you're going to counter highest and best, it is advisable that you do highest and best with a lowest starting point. And I think that too, besides just trying to cover ourselves legally, I think what it does too is it limits people believing they're negotiating against themselves, and it also removes the people who can't compete at that price, right? So if you say, for example, like if I'm listed at 700 and my best offer was at 710 and I want to do highest and best, I would put buyer to submit highest and best offer with a minimum sales price of 710. Right? Because that was my best offer. So now what I've done is I've acknowledged to my buyer who submitted 710 that theirs is at the moment is the best. And I've told everybody else, you've got to at least be at that 710 or better if you want to compete. And so if I have 3 or 4 buyers that were underneath that 710 and none of them want to come above the 710, and the one who was at 710 decides to leave it that way, then at least I know who I'm dealing with. Like, I know that I'm going to get that strongest offer. I'm not going to have people just trying to throw numbers out there or losing buyers altogether because they're like, well, highest and best, I thought this was my highest and best. So they don't have a target. So they're assuming that you've got all kinds of crazy offers because we don't share with the buyers what our best offer is. Even though we've talked about in the past that you have the right to do that, I always suggest that counter for highest and best should include that minimum sales price. It's not required. So if that's something that you choose not to do as part of your, that's your business choice, go for it. I just think it's the best option. Okay. Next one, close of escrow. Close of escrow to be blank days or sooner. That's it. That's if you have to address it. If somebody's writing you an offer with, 21-day or 30-day escrow, and you don't need to address anything with the close of escrow, then you don't need to. You can avoid that. You can bypass that one altogether. But if you needed it, there's the verbiage for it. This is where I like to still put in that if I know that I'm going to be presenting my offers later, instead of worrying about does this offer expire, I'm going to put in there, buyer agrees to extend expiration of offer to blank date, right? Like saying, we knew we were going to present offers late. We presented offers late. Now it's past your expiration. I'm sending you basically saying the expiration date is extended, so we don't have to worry about whether or not that counteroffer is still valid, even though now the counteroffer does address that, right? So again, you can put that in if you want to. You don't need to because the counteroffer addresses it, but if you want to be clear, you could do that. Okay. Paragraph 3D1, initial deposit. Initial deposit to be whatever the amount. I have there between $7,500 and $12,500. The reason that I put the $12,500 is because that's where small claims maximum lies. That's the most you can go for in small claims. Only just because I like to keep it. Those disputes that are over deposits are much easier dealt with in small claims than having to go through mediation and arbitration or mediation and litigation to get them back. And once you exceed that $12,500, if you want all your money back, that's what you're going to have to do. Okay. Deposit to be sent directly to escrow via electronic funds transfer within 3 business days after acceptance. Or if you guys want to reduce that amount of time, you can do that there. I don't necessarily see that it's super important to reduce the amount of time, but that's fine. The wire transfer thing is you really only have to write that if somebody suggested something other than wire transfer, because the default in the purchase agreement is wire transfer. So you can see that. So if it is already that way, wire transfer, right? Then you can leave off this whole section right here. You just have to put initial deposit to be and put the amount in, unless you want to change the amount of days. Okay. If you're going to change the days, then I would keep all of this verbiage and then just put 2 business days in there, or 24 hours, or whatever it is that you feel comfortable with. You could put that in there. Okay. So as you look here in 3D1, it would only be if somebody were to say, put in here, cashier's check. If they write that, then you would counter with the entire verbiage. But if this isn't checked off, if there's nothing there, then you could leave it as is. Okay. All right. Now we get into the loan. We're in paragraph 3E1, their first trust deed, first loan. If the interest rate is blank, buyer agrees to accept a maximum fixed interest rate of, and you could dictate, right? Because we've talked about in the past that whatever that number is, if their interest rate exceeds that number, and we get to the end, we get to where we're about to get the final loan approval and they want to cancel, even if their loan contingency has been removed, if their interest rate exceeds the number that's in this section right here, they can still cancel and not lose their deposit. So we want to make sure that we're clarifying that there is a maximum interest rate that they're willing to accept. You have two choices. Buyer agrees to accept the maximum fixed interest rate of blank, or buyer to disclose maximum interest rate and loan fees being paid with this signed counteroffer. And the only way they can do that is by sending a buyer counter. So if they send you a buyer counter with an interest rate that's fixed that you still don't believe is the right amount, you still have the ability to counter. Okay? Makes sense? So you have two choices. You could dictate and say, hey, wait a minute, interest rates right now are at X, Y, or Z. Add 25, add a quarter or half a point to that and go from there and feel confident with that. But you have to have something in there. Okay. All right. So questions so far? Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. All right. So we've talked about initial deposit. We've talked about the first trust deed. Now we're in this section where there is a closing cost credit, paragraph 3G1, right? Closing cost credit, pretty straightforward. If the seller is not going to provide a closing cost credit, you would just write seller will not provide a credit for buyer's closing costs. That's it. Very straightforward. If you want to change it, right, if you're going to decrease the amount, seller will provide buyer a closing cost credit in the amount of, and you put the amount in. Very straightforward. Okay. Now we get to compensation. This is the buyer is requesting for the seller to pay a concession to the buyer to cover the cost of the buyer's obligation to compensate the buyer broker. And so that's one of the things that we need to understand, that this is not the seller paying the buyer's broker. This is the seller providing an additional concession, whether there was a closing cost credit or not. This is a additional concession that the seller is paying to the buyer in order for the buyer to cover their obligation to compensate the buyer's agent. Okay, it's convoluted, but the money is not going directly from the seller to the buyer's agent, buyer's broker. Okay, so seller agrees to pay buyer's broker. If this is requested and your seller does not agree to pay the obligation of the buyer, then the counter should read as follows: seller will not pay any obligation that the buyer may have to compensate buyer's broker. That shall solely be the responsibility of the buyer. So if you get an offer requesting that compensation, that concession, and your seller says, absolutely not, I'm not going to pay it, then you counter back just that, not going to pay it. Okay. Or if you just want to pay a different amount of compensation than what was requested, seller agrees to pay blank % of sales price for concession to buyer to compensate buyer's broker. If the buyer's agent did not provide a BRBS or PSRA, add fully executed buyer representation agreement to be returned with this counter. You want to see proof that they agreed to get paid at least the amount that they're requesting from you, because the BRBC and the PSRA, whatever compensation is dictated in that form, is the most that the buyer's agent can earn on any transaction. So you want to make sure that they have one that's fully executed. They have one that is is enforceable. So not only fully execute, like you want to see it, what they have, but if there's anything wrong with it, you could basically tell them, sorry, this BRBC, this PSRA is incorrectly filled out and there is no compensation for the buyer's broker. So, I mean, there's ways to do that. Whether or not you and your seller want to not pay them or not, I mean, that's up to you. But you could always have a conversation with like, hey, this is incorrect and maybe you need to make these changes prior to us opening escrow, resubmit. Let's get this thing going, right? You could help. But here's your counters. If you're not going to pay, or if you're going to pay less than what they're asking for. If you're agreeing to pay what they're asking for, the only counter that may still happen if you're agreeing is this fully executed buyer representation agreement to be returned with this counter if they didn't send it to you with the offer. Okay, so keep that in mind that you may still need that counter even if you're agreeing to pay the compensation that was stated in paragraph 3G3. Okay, any questions? No? You guys are clear on this. You understand it. You know how it works. Here we go. If we increase the price in the offer for the seller to cover $10,000 for closing costs and 2% to cover buyer's agent compensation, why the seller can reduce commission to buyer's agent when asking for requests for repairs? Well, I mean, the question seems a little odd, but I think I understand where you're going. Okay, so now that compensation is basically a concession, which means it's a credit to the buyer. Anything that is agreed upon here, as soon as we open up negotiation during the transaction on one thing, everything is now open for negotiation. So in this example, you wrote an offer, you increased your offer so you could get a $10,000 credit and a credit for them to cover the 2%, the buyer was going to pay the broker. And then you do a request for repairs and let's say ask for $500, $1,000, $2,000, $2,500. And the seller's like, okay, well, you've got to make a choice now. I'm willing to pay that. But it's either I pay for those repairs to be done or the offer stays exactly it was and I give you that credit and that and the compensation, but I'm not doing both. The seller absolutely has the right to do that. So what happens is that for buyer's agents, you guys have to make sure that you understand that your compensation from the seller, that credit, that concession from the seller that they're paying to the buyer is not guaranteed if we change negotiations. If we lower the price, they can change that compensation amount. If we ask for a huge credit that wasn't agreed upon in the original document, in the original offer, they can reduce that compensation. Because you have a buyer representation agreement, if the seller says, hey, look, we're not going to pay that, your buyer is on the hook for that compensation. That doesn't change anything. That doesn't change. All it changes is that the seller is not going to credit the buyer for that compensation. If you have to move forward with that, your buyer still has to pay you the compensation that was agreed upon. Now, if your buyer says, well, I can't pay you that, and they want to buy the house, you have to step out. You can't represent them any longer. They have to do it on their own. Okay? If the buyer's paying the compensation from the beginning, if you never asked for compensation from the seller, so let's say now that G3 is not part of it. All there was a $10,000 credit, and then you asked for repairs or a credit because of repairs, and they said, yeah, we'll give you that one, but not this one. It'd be the same thing. They would absolutely have the right to do that. So just keep in mind, once you start to renegotiate the contract, everything is up for renegotiation. Okay? If you need an extension to close, if you can't close on time and you need an extension, and they say, yeah, fine, we'll grant you an extension, but that credit we promised you, gone. Or compensating your buyer's agent, we'll cut that in half, that concession. They absolutely have the right. Once you have to change the terms of the contract, everything is up for negotiation. So you guys got to keep that stuff in mind. Write a strong offer. Make sure your buyers understand how things work. And know that if you have to make any changes, you could be putting the amount of compensation you're getting paid at risk, or the obligation of paying your compensation, you're putting more of it on the shoulders of your buyer. Those are just conversations you guys have to have before you get into escrow. And this is part of the reason why I continue to talk about the same things over and over and over and over again, is because buyer's agents aren't getting it. Buyer's agents aren't getting it. The seller has no responsibility to pay you, period. And that means even if they do agree to pay that concession, they could take it away if you want to change some other terms. So you and your buyer better be damn sure that the terms you're trying to change, the negotiations that you're doing, are worth it, because you're putting your compensation at risk, or the concession to your buyer for your compensation at risk. Okay. Hope that answered your question, Melvin. But unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about it. If they want to change it because you guys are changing something or requesting something, nothing you can do about it. You can't fight it. So your choice then is your buyer either walks away from the property, they pay you the compensation, or you don't get paid and let your buyers go off on their own. That's it. Okay, loan contingency. If they're changing the time period, loan contingency be removed within blank days after acceptance. That's only if you're changing it, right? So like if, for example, we have 3L1 as the loan contingency is 17 days. If they've sent you an offer with a 21-day escrow but left it at 17 days and you want to shorten it, that's where you're going to do it. Okay. Same with the appraisal contingency. Appraisal contingency to be removed within blank days after acceptance. Copy of the appraisal to be provided to the seller at that time. I urge you guys to include at least, even if you're not changing the time periods, include this copy of the appraisal to be provided to seller at that time, meaning when they remove their appraisal contingency, because they're only required to give it to the seller if it's an FHA or VA, or if the property doesn't appraise and they're asking for a price reduction, then they have to give a copy to the seller. Otherwise, they're not required to. I want to add that in there because I want to take that away. You have to give me all the other reports. I want the appraisal. Okay? If you're going to ask them to remove it with acceptance of the offer, which I don't advise, buyer agrees to the appraisal contingency is removed with acceptance of offer, form C.A.R. attached to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. I'm going to take it another step. I'm going to have them sign the contingency removal form. Changing the required appraisal value. Appraisal contingency is based on an appraised value of whatever the original price is, to be removed within 12 days of acceptance, and a completed copy of appraisal will be provided to seller at that time. So basically what we're saying is I listed it for $700,000. You wrote me a crazy offer of $750,000, right? $50,000 over, $100,000 over. We still see those occasionally. And I want to say that, yes, you can have an appraisal contingency, but it's not going to be appraised based on your crazy amount. I'm confident in my 700 because I did the comps and I think that that's what the property is worth. So I'm going to say you have an appraisal contingency as long as it appraises for my listing price. If it appraises for less than that, then yes, we can renegotiate. But if it's 700 or above, you're on the hook for that appraisal gap that we talked about in the counteroffers. Okay? So you can see that most of this stuff is just very straightforward. It's very common sense, these answers to the counters that you need to do. The investigation of property, buyer to have blank days to do all investigations, and then we're going to adjust that time period based on the escrow period. Informational access to property, buyer to have blank days for informational access to property, adjust time period to match the length of the investigation period. That's it. If the property, so now we're at paragraph 3L8, leased or liened items. If the property includes leased or liened items, buyer to be aware leased lien item is leased, has a lien attached to the property. Buyer to assume lease, except lien remaining with the property. Pretty straightforward. Okay? And if it's solar panels, I'm also going to include that solar form with that. Now, if they check the box for this is contingent on the sale of buyer's property, but they didn't include the COP, then you're going to counter back C.A.R. form COP to be incorporated in this agreement, form provided to be signed and returned with this signed counteroffer. You could dictate the terms of their COP, or you could always just put this is please send COP with your counteroffer. This is where I would address the counter of the property being contingent on the seller finding a replacement property, because there is no reference to it in the purchase agreement. So this is just my trigger of countering back saying, hey, by the way, it is contingent on us finding a replacement property. So I would add that here. Sale is contingent on seller purchasing a replacement property and escrows closing concurrently. C.A.R. form SPRP to be incorporated in this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. Again, straightforward instruction, what we're going to do. Okay? Questions so far? I know we're moving quickly, but this is, we're just kind of recovering stuff we've talked over the last few weeks and looking at the counters and how they're written. And when this is all over, if you ask me nicely, I will give you a copy of this counter, but only if I get an email from you, not a message in the chat over here. Okay, so you got to send me an email so I can return it to you. Okay, occupancy. So now we're down at 3M1 and 2 right here. Occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m. 3 days after close of escrow at zero cost to seller. Seller agrees to pay blank per diem for any holdover beginning on day 4 after close of escrow. C.A.R. form SIP to be incorporated into this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. So that's just for a plain old seller occupied property. I'm getting the 3 days. I'm also incorporating a per diem if I stay past day 3. Now, here is what I would counter back if I was contingent. Occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m. 10 days after close of escrow at zero cost to seller. Seller agrees to pay blank per diem for any holdover beginning on day 11 after close of escrow. C.A.R. form SIP to be incorporated into this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counter. Very straightforward. So that's what you do with every seller occupied and everyone that is a contingent on them finding a replacement property. The next one is if there is a rent back that is longer than 29 days, right? 30 days or more. Occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m. blank days after close of escrow. Seller to pay blank money for possession of property, per diem or monthly amount. C.A.R. form RLAS to be incorporated in this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counter. What we're doing is we're doing all that negotiating at the beginning, because I see so many times where the sellers and buyers start trying to negotiate how long the seller is going to remain in possession afterwards, after the property's already been in escrow. And then it becomes a problem because not everybody has to agree. If I do this at the beginning, at least we all have an agreement. Okay. Paragraph 3M3, which is tenants. Seller will begin eviction if I'm going to vacate the tenant. Seller will begin eviction process once buyer has removed all contingencies. Buyer agrees to extend escrow as necessary to allow seller to complete eviction. This is if it is possible to evict based on local and state ordinances as well as existing moratoriums. I don't know if there's any more moratoriums, but you have to know whether or not the city or the county will allow you to evict that tenant before you agree to evict them. So that's why I put in red. If it's possible to evict, that's your answer. So if I have a property where it's a single family and it's possible for me to evict that tenant for the buyer, for the process of selling the house, I will do it, but I'm not going to start the eviction process until the buyer's removed all their contingencies, because now I know they're locked in, and the buyer has to agree to extend this escrow however long it's necessary for me to vacate that tenant, if that's how they want it. If you are now selling the property and saying, sorry, buyer, the tenants are your responsibility, then my counter is going to be tenants to remain in possession, any eviction to be the responsibility of the buyer. Regardless of if the tenants are being evicted or remaining, you have to have a TOPA. If there is no TOPA included, C.A.R. form TOPA to be incorporated, not TOP, to be incorporated. Form provided to be signed and returned with this signed counteroffer. Very straightforward. This is for the seller installing the smoke alarms and the carbon monoxide detectors. All it's saying here is that because we have to do it in 7 days, seller will install smoke detectors, water heater bracelet, and carbon monoxide detectors within blank days after acceptance, or seller will install carbon monoxide detectors and water heater bracelet after buyer has removed all contingencies. Keep in mind, though, this may cause appraisal to do a reinspection. The contract calls for the seller to be responsible if the cause of the reinspection was due to the seller, so you must include a counter for that. Buyer understands that delay of these installations may cause an appraisal reinspection. Buyer agrees to be responsible for any and all reinspection fees charged. So what we're doing there is we're saying, okay, we're addressing the fact that I don't want to do work on the property until I know that you are committed. which is removing their contingencies. If that happens and there needs to be a reinspection done, I'm now putting it back on the buyer instead of my seller being responsible for it. Now, if your seller is willing to just do those things, you don't need to counter it. I'm only putting this in here if the seller is not agreeing to. Now we're skipping to items included, excluded, right? If buyer requests items that seller is not willing to leave behind, items is or are not included in the sale property. Very straightforward, but you've got to counter it. If buyer does not incorporate items in the RPA, you have stated are included with the sale. Again, you have to counter and say these items are included with the sale of the property. If your seller is removing fixtures from the property that should have gone, right, then you're going to write in there, buyer to be aware, whatever those items are excluded from the sale of property, or you have your seller remove those items prior to marketing the property. That's your only two options, okay? Man, I thought we were going to finish today, so I'm going to try to rush, but we're running out of time. Here's your counteroffer for the NHD report, right? Name of company, what you're going to do. This is the termite. We've talked about this a lot in our purchase agreement. This is seller to provide termite inspection report prepared by the company of seller's choice and to pay a maximum of blank for any required Section 1 repairs. Buyer to be responsible for balance of cost for any Section 1 repairs and for any Section 2 repairs. That's an option. If you're saying, fine, I'm going to give it to you and I'm going to pay for it, but you have to pay for some of it. This is the maximum I'm going to pay. Or seller will not provide a termite inspection report or complete any repairs or clearance. I'm not doing any of it. Or seller will provide termite inspection report, buyer to be responsible for any required repairs. So those are your three choices if the buyer had requested a termite report and repairs. Okay. The optional wildfire disclosure, again, is not applicable, or seller will not provide the Fortress wildfire disclosure if required by lender, buyer to be responsible. So this is not a required form. Sometimes the lenders are requiring it. If they are, you're putting it back on the buyer. This is about the city inspection reports. They're required. Seller will provide city of blank pre-sale inspection report. Seller will not complete any of the required repairs. Buyer to take responsibility with the city of blank to complete the required repairs. Close of escrow. Very straightforward counteroffer. Escrow period, or the escrow company, right? Buyer and seller agree to pay escrow fees each their own. Escrow holder to be Pacific Escrow or seller's choice. Same with title. Those are all very common. You guys all know those. This is for the home warranty, right? So only if you know if the price isn't correct or what they're asking for is not what you're willing to pay. This is liquidated damages we talked about, right? That if it's not included in the purchase agreement, both parties haven't initialed, then it isn't part of it. But say the buyer didn't initial it and you want the seller does want that on paragraph 26. Let me get all the way. We jumped a lot. That was the end of paragraph 3. So we jumped to paragraph 26. Liquidated damages, the buyer didn't initial, the seller wants to. So we're going to buyer to initial paragraph 26 of the RPA and return an updated page 14 of the RPA. Same thing with the arbitration of disputes. If they didn't initial and we want them to, we're going to counter that. Okay. And then finally, when we're accepting backup offers, buyer is aware that this offer is being accepted as a backup offer subject to cancellation of current contract. Buyer is aware that they are in backup offer position number, whatever they may be, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Backup offer addendum to be incorporated into this agreement, form provided to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. So that's. Now, there are always going to be additional things that are going to come up that aren't norms, right? There's going to be issues that are going to come up that you may have to counter that we don't do on a regular basis, so it's not in this list. But this is probably 95%, if not 99% of all the things that you'll ever need to counter in an offer to get it cleared up. So, like I said, I appreciate you guys being here and I want to make your jobs easier and I want to make you better at what you do. So this will be available to you as long as you send me an email and request it. And I try to update this as much as possible every time there's new forms or a change to the purchase agreement. I make my changes to those counters and what reference paragraph it goes to. So again, don't forget to email me if you want this. If you missed any part of this, it will be on YouTube later. If you want to go back and go through it and look at the forms and kind of refresh, it's on YouTube. It's there. If you know somebody that would benefit from taking a look at it, please share my channel and, like it, subscribe to it if you haven't already. I hope you all have. I really appreciate this. I appreciate you guys being here and listening to me ramble on. We went a little bit longer than normal. Thank you all. Go be productive and take care of yourselves. See you soon.